understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How are you doing there? It is time for the podcast. This podcast will reflect on the momentous events of the last few days, particularly focused on Germany, what happened in Germany, the German election. For Irish voters, listeners, we're basically seeing very similar trends in Germany as we saw in Ireland and as we're seeing all over the world. We're going to break the podcast into three different bits. The first bit is we're going to take you through what actually happened in Germany. We're going to give you a sense of who voted for who and why. And we're going to then talk to Katja to put a bit of context on everything in terms of trying to, as she says, look for the soul of Germany, particularly a country that sometimes faces east, sometimes faces west. For so long of the history of our lifetime, it has been a Western-looking country, or at least the Western half has been dominant. Now that may well change, particularly as the new man, Merz, said his very, very first objective was to make Germany independent from the United States, which is a wholesale change in the CDU policy. Just so you know, if you're not that au fait with all things German, the Christian Democratic Union, the CDU, which was the party of Adenauer, the party of Kohl, the party of Merkel, and now the party of Merz, always had as its central ideological tenet the notion that it was anchored to not just the West, but the United States in particular. So the rejection on the part of the United States of all things Germanic in the last week will run very deep. Now, interestingly, the Germans have reacted by saying, okay, fair enough, we're going to make ourselves independent. It is fascinating. And John, I'm going to tell you, in all the noise, figure that stands out this week to give us a snapshot of what is important.
Go on.
Is a company called, have you ever heard of a company called Rheinmetall?
No.
So Rheinmetall, all German arms companies after the Second World War, all before the Second World War, they were called Waffen, which means arms, right?
Right.
So they changed most of their names to Metall, which means metal, the stuff you make the arms with.
Yeah.
They don't sound like arms companies, but they are. And one of the biggest arms companies in Germany is a German company called Rheinmetall, based in Dusseldorf. And in the last few days, stock markets worldwide got hammered and were falling, and there was panic on Wall Street and panic in tech stocks. What stock is up 6.8%? Rheinmetall. And why?
Really? That speaks volumes, doesn't it?
Because it's going to make the guns.
Yeah.
And the guns are what the Germans are going to make, because the Germans will now, the Bundeswehr, which is the German army, will now become the dominant army in Europe.
But I wonder as well is that, the German car market or manufacturers are in trouble as well. Would they start switching to arms manufacturing?
Of course they will. Of course they will. This is
that what they did in the run-up to World War II as well?
Well, I mean, don't blame the Germans for this. The Germans reacted. Come on. Get off your Victor comic worldview, Donnerud Blitzen. The States are only reacting to the carry-on.
And they have to, absolutely.
They have to. Anyway, so all I'm saying, listeners, follow the money. And the money right now is betting on the German arms industry, because the German arms industry has to react to a prospect, which is that the Americans will no longer be the army that guarantees European security. And the problem with NATO, it's like all these alliances, is once you breach the trust, once you say, well, you know what, maybe we won't come to your aid, or once you do the Donald Trump, which is, well, look, we might give you defense, but what's in it for us? You break the trust, you breach the omerta, and the whole thing falls apart. I happen to believe that NATO run by the Americans is over, and what we're seeing in Germany is the beginning of the process of the German rearmament, which sounds very 1930s.
Yeah.
But we are where we are.
Can I ask you then, let's get into some of the voting patterns.
Yeah.
But before we do, I think I mentioned this to you. Last week, I was reading an article, I think it was posted by Mark Little, about how there was some studies done on social media in the run up to the German election. And
Uh-huh.
it was saying that on the likes of TikTok and Twitter in particular, you know, those recommended to you stories,
Yep.
that on TikTok, there was 78% of the recommended for you stories were AFD skewed, and it was 64% on Twitter. Social media was being flooded with right wing stuff. Is that how it panned out?
Now, it's interesting you say that, right, John? One of the best things I read about Germany in the last couple of days was the AFD's support fell after Elon Musk came out and supported them.
Really?
Yes.
I didn't.
So lots of young Germans are like, no, I don't want that fella.
Yeah.
So, but I think that's what's basically happening is that lots of social media, because of the bias now of the various things like Twitter and X, are where they say leaning towards the right. But
Yeah.
let's look at the figures, right? The AFD, for all the carry on, failed to break above 21%. The incredibly big story in Germany was a huge surge in participation, right? That's the single most important, and I would say positive message to come out of the German elections, because that's what democracy should be. They should be participative, right? This runs completely counter to the Vance and Musk view. The Vance view, the caricature of Germany that he articulated at Munich was that there was an entire, democracy was not alive, it was not well, there was a resentful silent majority who'd been excluded from public life, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And they were being repressed by this liberal state, right? No, on the contrary, what basically happened is lots of Germans who hadn't voted before came out and voted. Younger Germans, Germans who were animated by the new election promise, and they were animated by the AFD. 1.8 million Germans who had never previously voted in this election. That's a huge
Wow.
figure, and it also goes against the grain that everyone's saying, oh, people don't care about democracy, et cetera, et cetera. They do, and they did in Germany last week. Now, we know in parentheses that most people say, look, it's the East Germans voting for the AFD, and it's the West Germans voting for the CDU. But just to give you a sense of who voted for who, right? The CDU got 208 seats in the Bundestag. The AFD got 152. The SPD, the old Socialist Party, got 120. And the Greens got 85. Now, I would say that we're looking at a grand coalition of the CDU, the former and old Christian Democrats, the CSU, who are a Bavarian version of the Christian Democrats, and the SPD. So basically, you're basically going to get the people
Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael.
It's kind of that, except exactly. It's not a million miles from that. Now, that gives Germany stability, but what it does do, it allows the extreme right and the extreme left to bite away at their heels over the course of the next 4 or 5 years. But
Yeah.
the big story in Germany is the fact that people who had never voted before came out and voted. And then you look at the AFD, who voted for the AFD, because that is the other big story. And of course, amongst workers, the AF, or people who describe themselves as workers, the AFD is now the leading party, right? 38% of people who describe themselves as workers, they voted AFD. 34% of the unemployed voted AFD. And interestingly, 21% of the self-employed voted for the AFD.
Okay.
But then you think, who voted for the rest? Now, fascinatingly, workers in Germany account for only 10% of all votes. Even though it's a massive manufacturing country, 90% of people don't regard themselves as workers in the industrial manufacturing way. So even though the AFD did very, very well amongst workers, it's a significant minority of people who regard themselves as manufacturing workers.
Yeah. Yeah.
What is fascinating is Germans are very old, right? A remarkable 40% of all German voters are over 60. 57% of all German voters are over the age of 50. And only 14% are under the age of 30, right?
Wow. That's
Okay.
incredible.
It's a very old country.
Yeah.
So the older people, pensioners, and the older people are all still voting the way they did in the past. So it's basically an old middle-aged vote that is the center in Germany.
So does that mean that it's a matter of time before they start dying out and the younger, more extreme elements start coming through?
No, because young people get conservative as they get older.
Okay.
That's the interesting thing,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
You don't tend typically to vote the same way at 50 as you do at 20. The young vote's very interesting, right? Because what you see is that younger voters voted extreme right and extreme left. Die Linke, which is the old German, East German Communist Party, right? And that is quite fascinating. And I'll give you one last figure, John, which is fascinating.
Yeah.
Lots of people talking about how young men are voting right, etc., etc. What has been most fascinating in Germany is young women are voting extreme left, not just liberal
Right.
left,
Okay.
but extreme left.
Why is that, do you think?
It's like, again, I'll just give you the figures, right? Young German women continued to go strongly to the left by a 30% margin. Okay? Now that means that young women were 30% more likely to vote extreme left than extreme right. Why
Mhm.
is that? Because they're interested in extreme left policies. They're interested in universal childcare, health care, good education system, fair rent, all these sort of things, which, for example, the young fellas are being animated by lots of things like anti-immigration, etc. But young women are much more animated by practical left ideas. So
Yeah.
the snapshot, John, of Germany is the following. You have the center held, but the center is old. However, the massive shift amongst young Germans was that young German men went to the right and young German women went to the extreme left, which is really fascinating. But what it does tell you is that the J.D. Vance thesis that Germany, like all of Europe, is anti-democratic, is being oppressed by a liberal state, and that there's a significant silent majority that are being attacked by the liberal elite. It's just not true. It's not true at all. But in order to put this into context, let's go and talk to Katja Heuer, amazing German historian, to get her sense of where the country is right now. I remember as Churchill described Russia as, I think it was an enigma within a puzzle within an enigma. But Germany is kind of enigmatic at the moment. And I can think of no better person to hold our collective hands and explain to us what is going on in Germany than the wonderful historian Katja Heuer, who has been a star of the Talkie Book Festival and I believe is coming back this summer, which we are delighted about. But Katja, you have been explaining Germany through your books, through your Zeitgeist Substack. You call the Substack Zeitgeist. What is the Zeitgeist in Germany at the moment?
How much time have you got? Well, thank
All
you for
day.
that most generous introduction. It's hard to tell at the moment because so many people feel, differently about it, and it's a very divided society. So to pin it down on one particular thing, if there is a zeitgeist, it's division. I think that's determining it. There are basically, I think, a lot of people in Germany want political change, and they don't really know how that's supposed to come about with the political system that Germany has, kind of favoring compromise over kind of clear policy, if you will. So I think that's the main thing at the moment, is that lots of people want change. They can't quite pin it on one particular thing, and they don't know whether that will come out of the election or is coming out of the election or not.
Now, Katja, I want to talk to you obviously about Russia. I want to talk to you about the war on two fronts that European people feel they're now fighting, with America on one side, Russia on the other. I want to talk to you about German history and that fear of the war of two fronts, etc., etc. But you wrote a fascinating piece about the nostalgia for West Germany. So there's a generation of Irish people, of German people, who really remember West Germany. Now, it's a long time ago, but in our heads, it constitutes an image of Germany that people feel reassured by. Explain to me about this nostalgia for West Germany, given the new Germany seems to be in such a state of perennial crisis?
Well, people often talk about Ostalgie as a nostalgia for the East, but I think there is an equivalent there, nostalgia for what people call the old Federal Republic. And I've seen that term used a lot in recent weeks and months as well, even by the left, actually, interestingly enough, despite the fact that this time was dominated by the conservative parties, by the Christian conservative parties. So I think where that comes from is a sense of stability, a sense of prosperity, the idea that West Germany recovered remarkably quickly from the Second World War, both in terms of its economy, but also kind of morally and politically. Very quickly, it was trusted again in the 1950s and 60s to rebuild its army, to join NATO, to become a really firm anchor of the Western world in Europe. And I think because kind of everyone knew where the journey was going, there was a sense of consensus there that many people now long for. So the first West German Chancellor, Konrad Adenauer, decided to very firmly make West Germany a Western country, bind it to the West, as he called it. And effectively, that meant that they were really looking to the US as the main partner. And with that, prosperity, which seemed guaranteed, with the economic miracle going on at the same time. So there wasn't this argument around, what should Germany do? Where should it go? Who should be in power? At one point, the Christian conservatives even got an absolute majority in a system of proportional representation. I mean, that's quite something.
Yeah.
So, I think what people long for is not so much the reality of that, because in absolute terms, people were poorer. Many people lived in half destroyed houses that weren't sort of rebuilt yet. And there was certainly not the degree of prosperity we've got now. But what they long for is the optimism for the future, that it will get better, and the consensus among society as to how to get there. And those are things that now seem to be lacking.
Well, can we just focus on Adenauer just before we get on to the modern day? So Adenauer comes in late 1940s. He is the former mayor of Cologne. He's already a political person in his own right. He's also very old when he comes into power, which is kind of interesting. But he says, okay, Germany is now a Western country. Allied to the United States, we are Western orientated. How new is this in German history?
Yeah, it's an odd thing. I think people today automatically think of Germany as a Western country because of that. But really, you could go all the way back to the 19th century and you find a Germany that is split between East and West, not least because the old Prussia, which was dominating this German state, reached so far into the eastern regions of Europe, sort of along the Baltic and into what is now Poland and Russia, that there was automatically kind of a looking east and a looking west going on at the same time. And most German chancellors, including Otto von Bismarck, the first one, tried to bridge that somehow and tried to sort of set up Germany as a Mittelmacht, as a middle centrist power, basically, and looking both directions. And when after the Second World War, Germany was suddenly split, literally into East and West, you had a much easier time as someone like Konrad Adenauer to say, this is the Cold War, we need to make a decision, and we're actually split into two countries. So one of them looked east, the other west. And, after reunification, that somehow had to be squared again. And you mentioned Adenauer's age as an interesting thing because he was so old. He was actually called Der Alte, the old man. It was an affectionate term, but that meant his own sort of legacy reached far back into the 19th century. His own experiences did, and so he was still very conscious of this East-West conflict that is going on in the German soul, and sort of tried to make a firm decision, even if that meant giving up on reunification in that moment, that West Germany would be a Western state. And that's kind of, I think, where the battle for the German soul is still happening today, again, with parties on the political fringes looking east rather than west, and the CDU, so the Conservative Party, sticking with its Western outlook.
Well, this is where I wanted to get to, which is the battle for the German soul. So you mentioned the 19th century Germany was very conflicted, looking east, looking west. Donald Trump has said he wants to bring the United States back to the 19th century. This is his model. He's a 19th century guy, although he doesn't seem to really reflect on that. But if you get the feel from him. So, now we have Europe with Germany as the major power, maybe an unwilling power, a reluctant power, but a power nonetheless, faced with this Bismarckian nightmare of this war on two fronts, except nobody expected the war to come from the Americans, but it has. So Germany is wedged in essentially a battle for ideas, territory, money, and primacy, facing Russia in the east and now America potentially in the west. What does that do to the German soul, so to speak?
Well, it makes it difficult for the people who saw themselves as Westerners, if you want to call them that, West-looking Germans, to stick with that, because ultimately they're now faced, particularly with a view to the war in Ukraine, they're now faced with a scenario where they want to stick to what they perceive to be a Western outlook, i.e., supporting Ukraine against Russia. But they're now faced with the United States that is keen to make a deal that may not align with those values. So suddenly the question is, where does this Germany look to, as the sort of big brother that it's always had? So, and equally for the Easterners, the war in Ukraine actually made this more difficult as well, because previously they'd argue, Putin is the victim here. This is just Western kind of propaganda, Western expansion. And then certainly when the invasion happened in 2022, there was a shockwave that went through the people who look towards Russia as the sort of German partner in terms of energy and so on. So in a way, what's happened to this Germany now is that it has to stand on its own two feet, kind of create its own identity, which it had never really come to a conclusion on that with the various kind of quite catastrophic experiments along the way. And that's the issue that it's facing now, is that there's no role model to look to.
So a lot of your writing, what I love about it is you locate the reader in your Substack in parts of Germany that most of us non-Germans are unaware of, we've never been to, we don't understand the people. You talk about Deutschland, this idea of, I presume, a slightly mythical middle Germany where the average person lives, etc. Today, I think you were in Weimar, but you've brought us to the Baltics, you've brought us to parts of Eastern Germany and former places. You've mentioned, places you were in Dresden last week, whatever. Explain to me, is there such a thing as an average German?
No, I don't think there is. And I think that's always been its strength as well. I think it's accepted that it has this kind of very fractured identity that is split into so many different regions. Also on religious grounds, you've got Catholics, you've got Protestants. In terms of culture, there's a very clear north-south divide going on as well. Now you got the east-west as a sort of fairly recent layer. And I think because people forget as well that Germany is such a young state, it's basically out of the major European states, is pretty much the youngest, only founded in 1871. And so back then, even Otto von Bismarck, who forged this Germany, realized that you can't make it into one homogeneous nation, and created a federal system as a response to that. So the idea that Bavarians can stay Bavarians, even though they're now also in Germany, I think was always there. So in lots of ways, Germans, I think, accept that, but there's also always been a drive towards national unity. And that weird conflict between those two things, the idea of accepting that one is not united, but somehow there's a desire for more cohesion. I think that's the clash that we've really seen since the 19th century. So what I sometimes try to do, even as I travel, I mean, I don't know some of these regions particularly well. You can only be from one place, really, in terms of my own, experience of growing up in Brandenburg, just outside of Berlin. If I travel to kind of, I don't know, mountainous areas of Thuringia, even though I've got family there, they're almost Frankish. They see themselves as kind of the same as the northern Bavarians. They're Franks in their culture and their language. And that to me is so, alien and far away as well, that I'm fascinated by it when I travel there, because I might as well be in a different country. So I sometimes try and sort of pick up these different identities and at least give a kind of snapshot of what I find when I travel there.
Now, you mentioned the word identity, because one of the legacies of the Second World War is this notion that most of Europe, in fact, most of the world, sort of said, never again, cannot have that again. And we cannot have that state that is driven by strong identity, by nationalism, by the ties that bind, by tribalism, because in some way that was the source of fascism, Nazism, etc. And that has been the sort of dominant middle of the road worldview since 1945. To what extent is this election and these last couple of months and these last couple of years telling us that that world, that sort of 20th century world, which is defined almost by what we are not, which is we're not nationalists, we're not tribalists, we're open, we're pluralist, we're tolerant. To what extent is that coming to an end and that playing out in Germany right now?
I think that's a thing that people didn't realize for a long time, because there was Angela Merkel there for 16 years with comparatively high personal approval ratings. And so it looked like what she was doing was what everybody wanted. But I think underneath the surface, a sort of sense of disgruntlement, change, also a feeling, that you have everywhere across the West, that particularly working class people basically feel that their identity is being eroded, that their sense of national belonging is now supposed to be a bad thing. All of those things, I think, were perpetuated under Angela Merkel kind of eroded under Angela Merkel to a point where it wasn't obvious when she was in power, but it sort of erupted afterwards for various different reasons, that, economics in particular playing a role with the war in Ukraine and the high inflation that came out of the COVID pandemic, all of those kind of exacerbating a sense of crisis. So I think that all of that sort of came together, and it's now what we're seeing is this kind of large scale disgruntlement, and people don't really know where to take it, because they still have, those 20th century or parties that were founded on that 20th century spirit that you just explained, and they don't seem to match necessarily anymore what people want. They've shifted over time as well. When you look at a party like the SPD, the Social Democratic Party, which was a classic working class party in the 19th century, very socialist, wanted to sort of combat, if you will, the excesses of kind of the unbridled capitalism that happened in the 19th century. And now it's a party largely of graduates, who've come through a kind of very narrow path of career progression within the political world, and they don't really understand why the plumber is angry, or why people don't feel like their jobs or their identity are as set in stone anymore as they once were, and why those certainties erode. So now they're down to 15%, which you'd literally have to go down to the 19th century to see. And then that wasn't considered a small number, then they were on the way up basically rather than down. So something's eroded there, something's shifted there, and parties, the mainstream parties in particular, need to think very carefully how they can maybe retain some of their 20th century ideas, take them into the 21st and reconnect with those voters.
Finally, Katja, before we go, J.D. Vance basically said the problem isn't China, it's not Russia. It's basically, he said in Munich, it's you. It's the managerial class you just spoke about, the SPD voters, the graduates, the people who are, as you say, very far removed from the plumbers, the people for whom, for example, immigration is always and everywhere a good thing. It's the open society, the liberal society, the less nativist, the better, all that sort of stuff. Do you think Vance was onto something?
It was really interesting seeing the response in Germany. I was in Germany just a couple of days later, and there was absolute outrage amongst sort of journalists and commentators and politicians. But then what I heard, particularly traveling in East Germany, people sort of just shrugging their shoulders and went, well, he's got a point. He sort of said, what a lot of us feel with regards to that, not so much some of the geopolitics, but certainly the idea that, the parties have removed themselves from the voters rather than the other way around. I mean, I become very frustrated speaking to German politicians about that, because they just don't get it, that they've changed. But I think the Swedish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, put it quite well in 2019, when she is a social democrat, so a centre-left politician, came to power on a promise to basically deal with immigration. And she said in one of her first speeches in office that it's not kind of, it's us, not you. She was saying, we've removed ourselves from you voters, not the other way around. And she was promising basically to give ordinary Danish workers their Social Democratic Party back. And that was an interesting approach, because I think she was onto something there, which, Vance has now put in very stark terms. But I think there's certainly something to the idea that a lot of the disgruntlement isn't down to Russian interference in voting and those kinds of things. Or, I don't know, parties tell me, we're just not very good at TikTok, whilst the populists are. I mean, they're all kind of means of, perpetuating or kind of making something bigger that already exists, but they can't create the actual underlying sentiment that they're tapping into. So, yeah, there's definitely something there about parties not listening to their voters. They're trying now, but it makes it quite difficult if you don't have that sort of natural connection to the people that you're trying to speak to.
We mentioned that in our kind of giant of the CDU, basically the founding member of the CDU. We have Kohl, we have Merkel, all these big beasts. But we also had Willy Brandt, the social democrat, and somebody that the older generation will remember. And he said one thing fascinating about Germany. He described Germany as an economic giant, but a political pygmy. And that was a legacy issue that Germans don't want to lead and people don't want the Germans to lead. So therefore, there's a sort of a vacuum in the center of Europe. You have this power that should be muscular and should be self-assertive, but actually isn't. Now, with the Europeans being dismissed, in effect, by the Americans and the Russians, will Germany adopt the mantle of power that is commensurate with its economic position?
I think it should. Whether it will or not, I'm amazed how many politicians still speak of Germany as a middle power. They always say Mittelmacht, which basically puts it in line with, I don't know, Austria.
Sweden or
Sweden,
Austria.
sort of the idea that they have middling economic power or political power and should therefore not play a role. It's really, I mean, some make it explicit like that. Others just say things like, well, these things are not for us to sort out. Those big powers like Russia and the United States need to. I mean, Russia is in economic terms not bigger than Germany, and still Germans sort of sit there.
In economic terms, it's not bigger than Bavaria.
Yeah, and still Germans sit there and are absolutely terrified. I mean, you tell me you're the economist.
Yeah, but it's not. I mean,
I'm just guessing here. No, but as the sort of one of the top 5 or so, I mean, it obviously changes, but third or fourth biggest economic power in the world, it should have the self-confidence to say, this is what we want and this is how we achieve it. But, me and others for years have been saying there isn't even a grand strategy, which is perfectly normal for most other countries to have a kind of list of things that you want to achieve. And then you plan your whole kind of policy around that. That doesn't exist in Germany. They're too frightened to even sit down and come up with, any sort of ideas to what they even try and achieve in the world, in which case things like energy policy or the war in Ukraine, those sorts of things will slot into place if you knew roughly what sort of world you want in Europe or in the world to suit German interests. But even the very idea of German interests, kind of raises all sorts of nightmarish scenarios in German minds that they just don't want to go there.
So you can't really escape the legacy of the little man with the tash.
Well, it's that, but it also goes further back, really, in the sense that, there were arguments because of this kind of relatively new German concept of a nation state, really, in the center of Europe. I mean, when Bismarck founded it, all he said was basically, for now, this is about stabilizing Germany and about making Europe accept the fact that there is now this huge giant in the center of it. But really, in terms of like world politics, he said, let's stay out of it because really the world's divvied up between the sort of British Empire, French empires, and so on. If we get involved in that, we're just going to annoy the big powers. So in a way, you could go back to that where there isn't really a firm sense as to what this new Germany is for, because really it was founded as an extension of Prussian power. Now, Prussia doesn't exist anymore, so the very foundation of kind of what Germany was once founded for isn't there anymore. I don't think it ever sat down and really knew what it actually wanted. Whilst obviously the Nazi legacy in particular then is an example of how that went terribly wrong when Germany did decide that it wanted to be bigger and then it wanted to dominate Europe and all the rest of it. So, it's kind of trapped between an inherent, I would say, identity crisis and then the legacy of what happened when Germany tried to solve that identity crisis by coming up with an extreme identity. And now nobody wants to really go there. And it's easier to just tag along and say to the other countries, you decide and we'll just decide to either go with it or go against it. But there must be kind of a precedent to kind of decide for and against, and it's done on an ad hoc basis, which I think is pretty not just not good, but I think is outright dangerous at times because it totally then depends on the current political flavor of the day, what Germany decides to do on any given issue.
Katja Heuer, I will see you at talkie, and I know you are in Germany and you're off to scribble away. If you are interested in all things German, Katja's Substack Zeitgeist is a must read and prolific. You're writing so much. It's wonderful. So, Katja, lovely to see you, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you so much.
Mark, let me ask you on the back of all of that. Merz, the new chancellor-to-be, was speaking during the week there about the need for Europe to be more united and moving forward together. And you were talking about the German arms industry cranking up. So is it possible for Germany to be that strongman in the middle of Europe that is badly needed now?
Well, this is the perennial question, John, which is, why does Germany not lead? Is it because Germany doesn't want to lead? And Katja was touching on it there.
Yeah.
Or is it because the rest of us don't want to be led by the Germans? That neither do we trust them, nor do they trust themselves. And of course, that is the legacy of not just the Second World War, it's the legacy of Bismarck, but it's also the legacy of Kaiser William in the First World War.
Yeah.
But the question we have to answer is, if not the Germans, then who? Now, in the past, we outsourced all that to the Americans, but the Americans have indicated very explicitly that they're in the transactional business.
Mm.
And now Germany is facing what Bismarck always feared and what William II's generals and Hitler's generals always feared is the war on two fronts. So you have the war against Russia coming ever closer. If Ukraine loses or is forced into submission, because this will only, as far as the Germans are concerned, embolden the Russians to go again in 2 years' time, 3 years' time, 4 years' time. On the other hand, you have the war on the West, which is the betrayal of Germany by the Americans, which happened very, very suddenly, almost overnight.
Yeah.
And as we touched on at the very top, the whole of West German diplomacy since Adenauer has been to anchor itself not only as the best Europeans, but as the best American-centered Europeans. And now America has said, well, you know what? We don't love you anymore. So it's like a divorce. You've been rejected.
It's not you, it's me.
It's exactly, that's what the Americans says. So I would say, John, that what we're looking at now is the biggest change in European diplomacy, politics, strategy in our lifetime. The Germans will lead, but reluctantly, and with France and Britain. They will demand that France and Britain give them nuclear cover straight away, and that will happen straight away. And then what they will do is try and create an alliance of the Scandinavians, who are very, very exposed to Russia, of course, the Eastern Europeans who want the Germans to have their back, and France, and of course, the significant military power in this neck of the woods is always Britain. So I think the way in which the world is going to change is that Europe is going to go towards some sort of European federal system. Now, this means two things. We'll touch on them now, we'll leave them, we'll come back to them. A federal Europe, a much more unified, much more integrated Europe, means a European budget. It also implies a federal tax system. It also implies deeper European political integration. The flip side of that will be maybe a one tax for all policy, which is not good for Ireland.
Yikes.
And this is the key, a European army, which will mean that Ireland will not be allowed follow this neutral, we're not really with you. They'll say, hold on a second, you've got to be with us. You can't be, as I said before, an a la carte guest at the restaurant. You can't say, "Oh, I want a starter and a little bit of
I didn't have dessert.
I didn't have dessert." Exactly. The Europeans will say, "No. There's a fixed menu here, and you want to be part of our internal market. You want to be part of our system. You want us to protect you, but you've got to sign up to our deal."
Then it's the third way. If that is forced on the various different countries, then you get the rise of Frexit and Grexit and Irexit and all that kind of stuff. And it's
No,
the
because
end of Europe.
ironically, Europe, as Mitterrand said, is forged in a crisis. And if Russia plays the role of the big, nasty bear just on our borders, about to threaten not one, but all of us, ironically, Russia and Trump, in their efforts to denigrate and reduce the European Union, might just be the two powers that kickstart the European Union into some sort of reaction. In a way, the Europeans were allowed to behave like children because there were adults in the room. The Americans used to be the adults. They are clearly not now.
Mm-hmm.
And what you might find is the threat of Russia is the very threat that forces the Europeans to think like adults. And then that will change the way in which the European Union operates. So you remember the Lisbon Treaty, the Maastricht Treaty, all these treaties, they were all designed to bring together these unwieldy, big coalition of countries together based on the lowest possible bar of entry, right? Because only by having a low bar of entry could they unite Portugal and Ireland and Croatia and Romania and Poland, right? So, you can more or less do what you want.
Yeah.
That's all over now. And the bar will be raised. And when you raise the bar, you have to make choices. Napoleon said, John, I knew you'd love it before we go. To govern is to choose. And now Europe has got to make that choice.